Hello and welcome to this webcast, which is part of Module 2 of the e-course on SDG implementation preparedness. My name is David Leblanc, and today we'll talk to you about integration and the Sustainable Development Goals and what does it mean for SDG preparedness audits. The main points of this short presentation are going to be the following. I will tell you a little bit about how interlinked are the Sustainable Development Goals. Then we will look at how the SDGs can facilitate integration of policy and action. We will examine what it takes for governments to promote integration in practice. And lastly, we'll look at some implications in terms of audits of SDG implementation preparedness. The Sustainable Development Goals are interlinked in many different ways. This has been recognized for a long time, even though the goals themselves date back only to 2015. It has been recognized for a very long time that issues from the environmental, social, and economic dimensions were related. For example, the impacts of access to safe drinking water and sanitation on health have been known for a long time. The impact of health on productivity and education outcomes have also been known. The effect of energy consumption on climate change. So a lot of links have been known to development practitioners, and policies have been devised to address those links. The difference with the SDGs is that, in contrast to, for example, their predecessors, the Millennium Development Goals, they explicitly recognize the presence of these links. And under certain targets of the SDGs, these connections are explicitly made. For example, if you look at target 12.4 under the SDG on sustainable consumption and production, the target states that by 2020, countries at the global level will have to achieve environmentally sound management of chemicals and all waste. Then there is some text following that, but the end of the target says, in order to minimize the adverse impacts on human health and the environment. So there is a clear link made in the target itself between the sound management of chemicals and the impacts on human health. And because many targets have this feature, the SDGs, instead of being seen as a collection of individual goals, can be seen as a network of interlinked goals and targets. This is what you can see on this slide. It basically shows the 16 SDGs that are issue or sector based. And you can see that just looking at the target themselves and the wording of the targets, all the SDGs are connected to at least one other SDG. And some SDGs are actually connected to many SDGs with many links, even sometimes between two SDGs. So this is a very different way of looking at a set of goals than looking at them as, a collection of individual goals without any relation. Just because of that, the SDGs could promote integration and at least integrated thinking more than was the case with previous development goals. Of course, if you look again at this diagram, you can notice that you can probably, each of you, think of different links, for example, between climate and oceans, between energy and oceans, that are not there on this map. It just means that the links or the linkages that exist have not been made explicitly in the wording of the goals, but it doesn't mean that in the context of a specific region, country, or even at a subnational level, they are not important, and this has to be kept in mind. So the presence of interlinkages among goals and targets calls for integrated policymaking, which is policymaking processes that take into account interdependencies among the sectors. And the objectives of this are threefold. The first is to harness co-benefits and synergies across sector. For example, if you invest to cut energy consumption based on fossil fuels, you will also improve outcomes in terms of climate change. The second one is to manage trade-offs and minimize negative impacts of policies done in one sector on other sectors. For example, there is always a tension between conservation of ecosystems and the use of resources from these ecosystems. And oceans and fisheries are a case where this applies. The third objective is really to increase efficiency in the allocation of public resources. And the question is really where to invest the government's marginal dollar. So if you take education as an example, where should you invest the marginal dollar of the government? Should you invest it in a classroom, new classroom, better classroom, into IT equipment for the students and the teachers, in higher salaries for teachers? Or should you just build better roads so that students can attend school in an easier way? In order to answer those questions, you must consider education in an integrated way within its local context and within the country context where it happens. And the answer is likely to be very different from one country to another. The challenges to integration have been known for quite a long time, at least since the emphasis was put on integration at the Earth Summit in 1992. Lack of integration has been repeatedly pointed as a major obstacle to achieving sustainable development. Institutional structures in general at the national, regional, international levels tend to encourage work in silos. The impact on other sectors is often addressed in a defensive way, for example, through social impact assessments or environmental impact assessments, which basically seek to address environmental and social issues once the decision to undertake a project has been already taken. And this is very different from integrating social and environmental concern into a problem definition and the identification of a solution from the very beginning, which is what systems thinking does. One of the problems is, of course, of a political nature and involve power relationships among organizations, because integrated solutions, which means solutions that integrate systems thinking, may in fact result in lower resource allocation from some subsector. If you go back to the examples of education that I was mentioning, maybe the Ministry of Education would receive less resources if it's decided that in fact the constraining factor to improve education outcomes is the lack of infrastructure. And obviously this is causes very difficult political economy problems to solve. Some broader dimensions, such as sustainable consumption and production and inequality, have proven very difficult to integrate fully in daily practices of ministries, in strategies, planning and implementation. This does not mean that everything is black. Progress has been registered since the 90s. For example, in terms of multidimensional approaches to poverty and safety nets, with many innovations in many different contexts, and increasingly policy work on clusters of sectors, which tend to be called also the nexus approach or nexus of sectors. And one of them is the nexus between climate, land, energy, and water. Yet, institutional challenges to integration remain important and generally tend to be much less studied than the issues themselves. As an example, I will take the nexus between climate, land, energy, and water. It's a nexus that has been studied for quite a while and has been studied by international organizations. The International Atomic Energy Agency and the Royal Institute of Sweden in Stockholm have a collection of ongoing case studies in 9 different countries, both developed and developing countries. And they have followed for at least 4 or 5 years now the development of joint studies on these sectors and their impacts on policy later on. And this set of studies have identified a number of institutional obstacles to better integration across those sectors. The first one is ad hoc institutional arrangements to address multi-sector issues. Those varies considerably across countries. The second one, which seems to be very widespread, is lack of political support, lack of governmental interest, or lack of government request for this type of work. The lack of cross-sectoral teams is also a recurring problem. Lack of data and lack of data sets that can be not only shared between organizations but even accepted as valid by institutions from different sectors is also a recurring problem. Lack of funding for cross-sectoral work is an important issue, and there are also difficulties when the studies are done in terms of disseminating the results, with often lack of interest from other ministries and even lack of understanding of what the results means from the policymakers. This seems to point to the need for a good deal of awareness raising among decision makers about the necessity of following integrated approaches and the usefulness of following such approaches. Also, the need to find ways to enhance cross-sectoral collaboration between ministries, the need to develop national cross-sectoral teams of experts who can work together, and finally to develop robust data sets and facilitate their accessibility. So what does it take in government? Obviously, even from the small number of examples that I mentioned in this presentation, there is no silver bullet. The institutional and political context are highly variable across countries, but some elements might help. The first of these is the presence of high-level comprehensive umbrella strategies, for example, a National Sustainable Development Strategy, that can serve as an anchor to sectoral strategies. So at least if this is the case, the energy strategy, for example, won't be in complete conflict with the conservation strategy. Such strategies, if they are to be effective, need to be effectively owned by all relevant actors, which mean not only sectoral ministries, but civil society and the private sector. There are still, unfortunately, many examples of proliferation of silo strategies, even in countries that have officially adopted national sustainable development strategies. A second element that can enhance integration is participatory structures. Institutional structures that enable the engagement of different stakeholders. And this is key not only as a token of participation, but because putting the right stakeholders around the table is usually key to framing issues in a system thinking way or in an integrated way. For example, if you look at fisheries, if you put only fishing companies or only conservation managers around the table, it will be very difficult to come to a problem definition and a solution that addresses all the impacts of the decisions you are going to take. Then there are some factors that are really linked to the structure and the incentives of institutions themselves. For example, are the budget processes that are in place enabling for cross-sectoral work? Is it possible when you want to work in a multi-sector fashion to even have a budget line for this? Then are there coordination structures that enable the decision making in a multi-sector context? What are the incentives within the institutions for cross-sectoral collaborations? For example, this goes from the mandates of the institution themselves to their charters, their internal rules and regulations, and resource allocation within the institution. And are there institutions for staff in these incentives for staff in this institution to work cross-sectorally? And to give you an example, something as simple as how staff working on projects in other divisions or with other ministries have their time charged to this other institution can make a huge difference on the incentives for staff and for their managers to allow cross-sectoral work to happen. Awareness raising and capacity development in government institutions is critical, and we've already touched on that. But it's also really important to enhance the capacity in every administration for system thinking, for integrated planning, and this also goes with a robust science policy interface, including a capacity for modeling, a capacity for long-term scenarios, and the capacity to communicate effectively with decision makers the results of integrated approaches. And lastly, and this is the case every time institutions are involved, at the end it comes back to the issue of political will. Are policymakers willing to consider other ways of doing things, and are they willing to spend political capital on this, even in political economic context that might be very difficult? Let's come back now to the implications in terms of audits for preparedness for the SDGs. I think it is clear that in an ideal world, audits for SDG preparedness would need to consider something called readiness for integration, alongside with the other thing that they should consider. This implies to look at a number of dimensions, and I've touched on some of them above, earlier in this presentation. Other dimensions may be very important in some contexts, and I've not mentioned them. For example, international cooperation. Silo problems in international cooperation have been known for a long time. They can exist, and they can complicate national efforts for integration. In the case of preparedness audits for the SDGs, it may be useful to distinguish two levels of auditing. The first one would be the government capacity for integration in general, in a cross-sectoral way, and this goes to a macro-level assessment, in some sense, of whether the institutional structures are in place for cross-sectoral dialogue and policy integration. And this can encompass, for example, the presence or the existence of multi-stakeholder consultation bodies, of coordination mechanisms, etc. The second level would be the capacity for integration in relation to specific issues or themes, for example, for the health sector or for education. And in this case, audits, national audits of preparedness could consider 4, 5, or maybe even less important nexuses or issues that are really critical in a specific country context. So obviously those issues or nexuses would be different across countries. Among the dimensions that audits could examine would be whether the government has already done the work of looking at SDGs interlinkages and identified those that are the most important in the context of this specific country. Then second, whether current policies are consistent with the findings of this exercise. That is, whether the policies actually reflect the consideration of important linkages. And finally, whether appropriate elements are in place to enable integration with respect to those linkages in terms of institutions, coordinations, incentive systems, as already mentioned, but also in terms of things like, for example, public procurement, which can make a huge difference in terms of what's possible and what's not possible for public administration. And last point from this presentation, from the perspective of supreme audit institutions, there is probably a need to raise awareness among auditors on the importance of considering interlinkages between sectors, policies and programs, and of the implication of this for their audit work. And there's probably a need to build the capacity within Supreme Audit institution to audit complex issues. And this probably requires the creation of multi-sectoral or interdisciplinary audit teams.